Welcome back to the 71st online episode of Peacetime, hosted every Sunday morning by Peace Point with myself, Phra Nicholas Thanissaro, live streaming from what I expect to be, fingers crossed, the last time from our meditation center in London before returning to the States. Last time you saw me, we looked at blessing number 29 on the site of a true monastic. With the Dhamma talk today, we'll continue in our series on enlightened living to the fourth and final blessing of the instilling oneself with higher virtues subsection, that is number 30, on regular discussion of the Dharma. So today's session will run to about an hour and 10 minutes, starting with a 20-minute talk to define and explain the objectives of a Dharma discussion, then 30 minutes of meditation and 20 minutes on the practicalities of organizing an effective Dharma discussion. Many people can talk all day and all night on ephemeral matters, but if they had to talk for even 5 minutes on the subject of the Dharma, they would be left scratching their head. Discussing the Dharma is no easy skill. Even the Buddha himself spent many lifetimes perfecting his speaking and listening skills before he could move on to discussion of the Dharma. Dharma discussion is a challenge because it is the culmination of almost all the blessings already mentioned. Back in blessing number 7 on learnedness, Dharma discussion required participants to listen carefully to others first before expecting to be listened to themselves. Later in blessing number 10 on effective communication, we learned about the hallmarks of effective speech, rather than just saying what others want to hear by complimenting and praising them. Even if someone speaks 7 languages, they could hardly be considered an effective speaker if everything they said is controversial. More recently, in blessing number 22, those joining a discussion were expected to be respectful. In other words, since most things in the world have pros and cons, you'd be expected to emphasize the constructive aspect of things you talk about. Following on in blessing number 23, we learned that those in a discussion need to be humble, not looking down on others or their opinions. Later in blessing number 26, it was advocated that, having listened to many Dharma talks, our understanding would come from reflecting on what we've learned and otherwise interrogating these teachings. Of course, it is an acquired taste to want to listen to the Dharma rather than gawk at a comedy show, because firstly, it is hard to concentrate on something abstract like the Dharma when we are used to focusing on more concrete matters. A second challenge is that it's hard to be receptive to the Dharma. Supposing the monk talks about precepts, we run the risk of realizing that we haven't managed to keep our own precepts very well. Therefore, to be reminded of our bad habits is always unwelcome. It's hard to want to listen to someone talk about your shortcomings. It's like touching on an open wound. This is why people like sitting right at the back of the lecture hall whenever listening to Dharma teachings, in case the teaching monk puts them on the spot. Furthermore, in blessing number 27, we learned that those in a discussion need to be patient. The sort of patience needed is a patience in the face of interpersonal conflict, when differences of opinion arise. Most recently, in blessing 28, we learned that those in a discussion must be open to criticism. You will know about this as soon as the topic of Dharma discussion gets personal. We may find during a discussion that others will test our patience first to see how much criticism we are able to accept. If someone is due some heavy criticism, a fellow participant in the discussion might start by doling out minor criticisms first, such as, when you're listening to sermons, you shouldn't fidget because it shows lack of respect towards the Dharma, and gradually get heavier. For example, when you're listening to sermons, you shouldn't daydream because it shows lack of respect towards the Dharma. This is why you can see that discussing the Dharma is no easy matter. If it were easy, we would already have come across it much earlier in the series of blessings. However, this subject has been placed at the 30th step of the path of Buddhist practice for the reason that it may be disastrous to organize a Dhamma discussion if you don't know what you're doing. Dhamma discussion is much more demanding than just listening to the Dhamma talk, because discussion means that it's interactive. Similarly, it's easier just to talk and have people listen to you than it is to respond to what others are saying. The objectives of this blessing are firstly to discuss the Dharma in a way that brings benefit to oneself and others. In the words of the Buddha, a large merit awaits if Dhamma discussion is practiced correctly, because at Dhammapada verse 354 he said, Sabbadanang Dhammadanang Jinati, which translates as, the gift of Dharma excels all other gifts. The second objective of discussing the Dharma is to discuss it in a way that does not detract from the value of the Dharma. This seems to be mentioned because discussing Dharma in an inappropriate or distorted way will hasten its disappearance from the world era. This is why the Buddha taught in the Anguttara Nikaya's Anapati Sutta, and I paraphrase, that monks who claim there is no harm in breaking this or that monastic rule, or who fabricate new monastic rules, bring harm and unhappiness to the many folk, suffering to humans and angels alike, and in so doing, earn grave demerit, causing a premature end to the Dhamma. He went on to explain in the Bala and Samajita Suttas, again of the Anguttara Nikaya, that, and again I paraphrase, distortion of the Dharma includes faking what the Buddha said or claiming the suttas contain things they don't, which reiterates what was mentioned in Blessing 3 about the inadvertent harm of making jokes about the Dharma. The third objective of discussing the Dharma is to acquire wisdom, because Dhamma discussions are intended as a way to cultivate wisdom. The Buddha praised wisdom above all other things, regarding it as beyond price, because in the Jara Sutta, he taught Panya Naranang Ratanang, or wisdom is the wish-fulfilling gem of the people. An observation in contrast to many from the latest generation who seem to think that a wish-fulfilling gem comes in the form of the latest video game console. Since life is always full of problems to solve, whether it be problems from physical hardship, the people around us, or inside us from illness and pain, we need to rely on wisdom to resolve all of them. The wisdom each person can draw upon comes from two main sources, as mentioned in the first blessing, namely from discussion with the wise people around us and from the insights we get from our intuitive abilities in meditation. The fourth and final objective of discussing the Dharma is to sharpen our wits, because having to think and apply the Dharma we know in real time during a discussion is a sort of performing art. In order to do so well, we need to be quick-witted, a quality known in Pali language as patipana. Of course, all four of these objectives are in addition to the 5 objectives of listening to the Dharma already mentioned in Blessing 26. So before we do anything else, it is necessary for us to define both the word Dhamma as well as what we mean by a discussion. The word Dharma is not easy to define, and we have up to 100 meanings depending on the context. In Blessing 16, we have already described Dharma as being a description of the reality of things, while at the same time referring to virtue. However, at this stage in the 38 blessings, it is perhaps useful to reflect that the Dharma, in its context as the teaching of the Buddha and as the second component of the Triple Gem, is recognizable by the following 6 characteristics. Firstly, it has a characteristic of being properly expounded by the Exalted One, or Swagato Bhagavata Dhammo. Secondly, it has a characteristic of being clearly perceived within ourselves, or Sanditiko. Thirdly, it has a characteristic of being timeless, or Akaliko. Fourthly, it has a characteristic of being inspiring to those who see it to call others to come and see it, or Ehipasiko. Fifth, it has the characteristic of being something that is internalized, or Opanayiko. Lastly, it has the characteristic of being something that is realized subjectively by the wise, or Pachatang Veditapo Vinyuhi. The word discussion means that there must be at least 2 people in the conversation about a subject of the Dharma, rather than other things. Such discussions should ideally occur regularly, and they should be aimed to increase the wisdom of the participants rather than show off who is the smartest, as if it were some sort of a contest. arranged on an appropriate occasion, and taking no more time than is appropriate. Discussion of the Dharma can be divided into two types. The first category is that of giving a Dhamma talk, which is more or less a monologue on the Dharma. This subject has already been touched upon in Blessing 26, however. In this blessing, we are no longer simply on the receiving end of the teachings, because at this point in the blessings, we ought to be ready to speak on the Dharma for ourselves, without devaluing the Dharma by doing so. The second category is that of Dharma debate, which means a discussion between two or more people. So to look in more detail at each of these two categories, if we are talking about giving a Dhamma talk, beyond the 5 qualities of a good Dharma preacher, the Buddha taught in the Samyutta Nikaya's Jandupama Sutta that anyone who teaches simply to attract followers has missed the point. However, those who recognize the benefits brought to those who learn Dharma with the 6 characteristics I've just mentioned, it's closer to the true objectives of a Dharma discussion. In addition to these basic skills, according to the Anguttara Nikaya's Gesi Sutta, different approaches are required for training different types of people in the Dharma. And at this point, you might think of the parable of the 4 sorts of lotus flower above the water, at the water surface, below the water surface, and beneath the mud. The disciples who are lotus flowers above the water need to be taught gently by elaborating the meaning of good behavior and the wholesome fruits of such good behavior. Those below the water surface need to be taught sternly by elaborating the meaning of evil, yes, for once I am not using the euphemism for this term, and the harm returning to the perpetrator of such evil behavior. Those who are on the water surface need to be taught by a combination of these two means. And those who are below the mud, who cannot be helped in any of the previous 3 ways, will need to be put on a back burner until such time that they can gain benefit from regular teaching. Turning to the category of Dharma debate, although giving a one-way talk on the Dharma is challenging enough, debating on the Dharma is more challenging still, because one must have the ability to think on one's feet. It's not only a question of accuracy in explaining the Dharma, but also of gauging the needs of the listener. Sometimes the listener's needs can be apparent from their appearance or expressions as they are listening. More commonly, it's apparent from the nature of the questions they ask. In this respect, though, not all questions can be taken at face value. To give an example, if I travel on public transportation, it is common for people to come up to me and ask something like, how about rebirth? It is very obvious that they've gone to great trouble to think up a deep question suitably profound for the occasion of having tracked down a real-life monk. In fact, for the most part, it's likely they don't even know what they're talking about. So, the job that falls to me is to size up that person and consider what do they really want to know here. Generally, I'd start off by directing them to something a little more basic. I might say, well, rebirth, it's a really quite an advanced concept, and if you want to get a satisfactory answer to things like that, then you have to find it out for yourself. And the most important way you can find out for yourself is to start with some sort of personal meditation practice. In that way, I would gradually move to the conversation towards the question that perhaps the person really wants to know. Oftentimes people see you as a monk and they ask, why are you dressed in orange? Really, they're not interested in the color. It's not like they're going to dress up in orange too. They're probably interested to know what the point is of choosing to be a monk, and they don't know how to ask an appropriate question about that. So asking about the color orange is a good start, but it may not really be what they're interested to know about. So the first rule of Dhamma discussion is that not all questions are to be taken at face value. For a Dhamma discussion, it's necessary to read between the lines. Amongst 5 types of question that are not worth answering directly are when you can tell a question comes firstly from those who are not really interested in your answers. Secondly, when there are those who ask a question when they already know the answer, but they're just trying to test your knowledge. Thirdly, there are those who ask a question because they are teasing you. More seriously, in a 4th category, there are questions that come from those who like to talk about meditation attainments but never practice meditation for themselves, the spiritual equivalent to looking up the answers at the back of the book. Lastly, there are rhetorical questions that are statements rather than questions. By contrast, the sort of questions that deserve to be taken seriously and possibly at face value, and which at least deserve a proper answer, are questions that show a serious interest, questions from a practitioner about things they have not yet seen for themselves, questions from a practitioner to verify things they have already experienced in spiritual practice, or questions to alleviate doubt. In short, contributing to a Dhamma discussion needs a multifaceted strategy in answering questions. It turns out that in the Anguttara Nikaya's Banha Sutta, the Buddha enumerated 4 different strategies for answering a question. Firstly, it's possible to answer a question directly, which would be suitable for questions that have been well thought out in advance. The second way to answer a question is by giving what's known as a divided response. In other words, where your answer requires that you make a distinction clear. If someone is mixed up in their practice because they are confusing steps which should be made separate, or practicing things in the wrong order, then your answer must start by making a clear distinction between the component parts of an issue. Sometimes you need to limit the scope of what you're answering. Sometimes you need to make sure that both you and the listener understand the same thing by the terms you're using in the dialogue. For example, when you're talking about evil, but they are talking about sin. A lot of misunderstandings, for example, happen when the word merit is used unexplained. A third possibility for answering a question is to pose your own question in response. Sometimes people ask questions not because they're interested in the answer, but they are interested in whether you can answer. In such cases, maybe you should ask such people why they are asking such a question. In some cases, you need to ask them whether they would like to know or whether they would like to experience it for themselves without actually answering. Often you need to ask a question in return if their question is not clear to you. For example, have I understood correctly that such and such is what you're asking? Only when you get confirmation would you go on to answer the question. A final possibility for answering questions is to keep your silence, or maybe just avoid answering. This is otherwise known as noble silence, or in modern-day parlance, no comment. It is applicable when giving any answer irrespective will only serve to muddy the waters further. An example of this is when people ask about the specific inner experiences gained as a result of meditation, but they have never practiced it for themselves. It is not much use to give an answer because they would not believe you, whatever you answer, and they may use what they've remembered instead of striving to attain such an experience for themselves. So just before we come to time for our meditation, we have time for a quick story, which illustrates the point for Dhamma monologues that it is neither the breadth of your repertoire nor your academic prowess that counts as much as having personally mastered the virtues that you are speaking about. There was once the son of a wealthy Brahmin of Savatthi who entered the Buddhist order. He dwelled in the forest, fulfilling his novitiate, and came to the Buddha to request a subject for meditation. Seeing that Sariputta was otherwise occupied, the Buddha gave the novice a short teaching himself, starting with the words adicetaso, to the effect that there is no sorrow for the monk of transcendental thoughts. The novice learned this verse by heart and returned to the forest to reflect on it. Although he didn't know any of the other verses of Dharma, he understood this one thoroughly and eventually became an arahant by contemplation of it. Later, he came to be known as one exclamation or ekudaniya, because he would exhort others to listen to the Dharma and he would recite this single verse that he knew. He chose to reside in a remote location, but he was not lonely because each time he had finished his recitation, the guardian spirits or devas in the forest rejoiced in his merit resoundingly. On one occasion, 2 learned monks who were well-versed in the Tipitaka, the equivalent of modern-day academics, each accompanied by a group of 500 monks, visited this particular monk at his dwelling place in the forest. Ekudana invited the 2 monks to preach the Dharma. They inquired if there were many who wished to listen to the Dharma in such a remote area. Ekudana told them that even the guardian spirits of the forest would rejoice at the end of every discourse they hear. Thus reassured, the two learned monks took turns to preach the Dharma, but when their discourses ended, there was complete silence from the guardian spirits of the forest. The learned monks were puzzled, and they doubted the words of Ekudana, but he insisted that the guardian spirits always rejoiced at the end of every discourse. The two learned monks then requested him to do the preaching. Ekudana recited the usual verse, and at the end of the recitation, the guardian spirits rejoiced resoundingly as usual. Some monks in the retinue suspected the guardian angels inhabiting the forest were showing favoritism to Ekudana, so they reported the matter to the Buddha on their arrival at the Jetavana monastery. However, the Buddha admonished them, saying, "I don't say that a bhikkhu who has learned much and talks much of the Dharma is one who is versed in the Dharma. One who has learned only little and knows only one verse of the Dharma, but fully comprehends the Four Noble Truths as a result of it, and who is ever mindful, is the one who is truly versed in the Dharma." So it turned out that the guardian angels in the forest were better judges of Dharma authenticity than monks or academics in this story. Therefore, although Dharma debate can be thought of as being like an academic conference, like the sharing or exchange of ideas in order to foster academic progress, regular discussion of the Dharma goes deeper than academic knowledge, bringing wisdom and the pathway to liberation from suffering. It reminds me of exemplary teachers like the Master Nun Kunyai Chandra, who founded our main temple in Thailand, who never opened an academic book in her life, but who developed the ability to debate the Dharma, coming entirely from her own striving in meditation and eventual inner attainment of transcendental experience. So, now that we are a little more well-informed about what is meant by Dharma debate, let's see if we can prepare the subtlety of our minds for Dharma debate by settling ourselves down for 30 minutes of meditation, which today is a recent live recording of the Equanimity in the Face of Special Hindrances track. If at this time you would like to find a comfortable sitting position for yourself as you listen to my guidance. So if you'd like to settle yourself down into a comfortable posture for your meditation practice. For those of you sitting on a meditation mat, then sit cross-legged with your right leg over your left leg. And if you're sitting on a chair, then sit with your back fairly straight. And either way, your hand should be resting palm upwards in your lap. The index finger of your right hand touching against the thumb of your left hand. Try to make sure your body is in a fairly upright position without slouching forward nor leaning too far back, so that both your circulation and your breathing are relaxed and unimpeded. Because everything about the meditation ought to be relaxed. If you are unnatural in the way you're sitting, then it will be hard to sit comfortably for very long. And even if you are sitting in a lazy way, ultimately you'll end up with aches and pains. And close your eyes very gently. Close your eyes so that your eyelids are just touching very gently together. Making sure there's no pressure around your eyes. Closing your eyes in just an ordinary way. And at this point you might like to make a mental scan down through the whole of your body to make sure each and every muscle is properly relaxed. Starting at the top of your head and scanning down through the whole of your body, relaxing each and every muscle as you go. So down through your face, relaxing all the muscles, your jaw, letting your shoulders drop, relaxing both arms, forearms, hands and fingers, relaxing the whole of your torso, chest, trunk and abdomen, the muscles of your back, both legs, all the way down to your feet and your toes. And if you still notice any places in your body where tension still seems to linger on, then do your best to relax it as far as possible. Having relaxed our body, we can turn our attention inward to relax our state of mind. And in this respect, we must let go of all things and not be attached to them. Not being attached to our physical body, not worrying about anything to do with our physical body. Our body is just like a location for the mind, a place to establish the mind, or a pathway towards peace of mind. In effect, our body is only transient. Sometimes it's like we have our body on loan. So ultimately our body is something that we don't need to obsess about. Really, the more important thing, especially for our sense of well-being and for our pathway towards spiritual knowledge, is to free our mind of thought. And really you can say that all the good things that we cultivate in our lives contribute towards freeing up our mind, unburdening the mind, allowing the mind to travel towards a better version of ourselves. If you're looking for a sense of meaning in life, then you could say that that's why we're really here, on this quest for wisdom in our lives. So we try not to be caught up with things which hold us back from this quest, obsessing about our appearances of others. So we allow the mind to let go of all of these things, unburdening, so that the mind can find its true focus. And at this point in our meditation, we might like to bring our mind back within the space of our body, possibly to a place down at the very center of our body, somewhere around our solar plexus, which is a particularly important place inside ourselves, because it is to do with how the mind becomes established from the point of conception onwards, right to the time when body and mind must separate after death. Again, it's from this point that the two go their separate ways. It's also the place where the mind wakes up in the morning, and the place where the mind can go to sleep at night. But apart from that, especially from meditation, it's a place where we can gain freedom for our mind, where we can break free from our physical constraints. This is particularly important for the mind setting out on a journey inward in search of wisdom or enlightenment. So meditation is mostly about establishing our mind at the center of the body as an anchor for the mind, where if the mind wanders it can return to this point at any time. As we gradually build up a familiarity with this point at the center of ourselves, until at a certain point the mind will be able to go through the center, along an inner trajectory of the mind that brings the mind to deeper dimensions of reality. Sometimes we find it easy to keep the mind in place, in which case we just let the mind settle at that point, almost using our own sense of intuition to keep the mind in place. But for those who are still unclear about exactly where the mind needs to be, then it may be better to start out with some sort of image in the mind as a sort of point of reference or an anchor to keep the mind in place. Once the mind becomes properly adjusted, and whatever we start out with will become a sort of sphere inside of ourselves. A sphere that expands outwards, becoming softer and revealing at its center a pathway which opens up to lead our awareness inward. Something that is referred to as the shared spiritual path, a single pathway that leads towards peace of mind. If we find there are still thoughts cropping up in the mind, we do our best to ignore them, at least not to elaborate on them, allowing the mind to calm down into silence and quiet, until at a certain point the thoughts will disappear altogether, leading to a state known as a standstill of the mind. And if our mind is not yet at a standstill, then we have to pretend that the mind is already at the center of the body. It's almost like faking it until we make it, bringing the mind to the center to build up a sense of familiarity until it's ready to stay there all by itself. And even though our awareness might not be exactly at the center of the body, the fact that we allow our mind to be free of worry at this point, and continuously with a balance of lightness but also focus, before long the mind will find its own way to the center. And once the mind comes into balance, then it will find its way precisely to where it needs to be. In the beginning of our meditation there will not be a sense of brightness apparent. We may have a feeling that there's spaciousness inside us, almost as if our awareness had become light in weight and more at ease. Sometimes we may feel as if we could almost float, or as if there's a sense of spaciousness inside. Sometimes it's as if our breathing becomes more refined. Sometimes it's as if we are all alone in empty space. Often there's a sense of expansion which accompanies this state, as if our whole awareness seems to expand in one direction or another. If our awareness expands upwards, we may feel that our whole body is expanding, as if we were so tall we might reach the ceiling. At other times it may feel as if it's contracting, almost as if our body were being pulled downwards towards the ground in front of us. Other people feel as if they are suddenly falling, with a lurching feeling at their center, similar to a plane in clear air turbulence. And if it's less refined than that, sometimes we may feel as if the body is swaying, as if we are rocking in a boat or in a cradle. We may merely feel that the hair on our body is standing on end, or as if our heart rate suddenly became more elevated than usual. For others, it's as if the body loses feeling. Or it may be as if our legs or our hands have become numb or disappeared. But if we come across any of these sorts of feelings, so-called special hindrances in our meditation, we should recognize them all as being symptoms of the fact that meditation is on the brink of progress. We should continue to maintain our sense of mindfulness, to keep ourselves on track, and at the same time we shouldn't get too excited about such experiences, certainly not to the point of elation. If the experiences seem untoward, then we shouldn't be afraid of anything, simply maintaining our mindfulness to the point where the wisdom breaks through to the point of equilibrium. And you come to the point where there are no more thoughts anymore. To be almost as if you cannot think of anything even if you were to try. It's very different from when we started out in meditation, where we couldn't stop our mind thinking. For some people, they may be worried by the apparent sensation of not breathing anymore. Even though you might feel perfectly happy in your meditation, there is a temptation to think that because you're not breathing, then there's some sort of risk involved. But in fact, the body is getting all the oxygen it needs. You may find that when your mind is steadfast at the center of the body, your body will set itself up into a perfect posture for meditation. And even though you're aware of what's going on around you, but nothing in the outside world, even the sounds and sensations, will disturb your peace of mind anymore. Once you reach this sort of place in our meditation, sooner or later the mind will drop through the center. Often you come across a sphere arising in the mind going in the opposite direction, bright and clear. These may vary in size, sometimes small like a star in the sky, sometimes medium sized like the full moon or a shining sun, sometimes much larger, something known as the sphere of the initial path. It arises at the center, then we know that this is what it is. And it's recognized as a trailhead for the path that will lead towards peace of mind or attainments in meditation. And if we're lucky enough to come across such experiences, then it should be something that we try to maintain the whole of the time. Not just during our meditation, but whether we're standing, walking, sitting or lying down, eating or whatever task we may be doing. You should maintain it the whole of the time. Reflecting at the center of our body to maintain this state of mind. Whether our eyes are open or closed, we should try to see it in our mind's eye the whole of the time. So if we can maintain it in this way, then it will be something that allows us access to a pathway towards inner attainments, as something that we can build up upon for the rest of the life remaining to us. For now we keep our mind on track lightly and gently, without using force, without trying to rush the process, simply doing what is comfortable for us, and being okay, accepting of the experiences that arise at our own level of progress. So we continue in this way lightly and gently just for a few more moments now in silence, until we come to the appropriate time. Find your mind wandering off onto other things each time you realize. Simply bring your awareness back again to the center of your body as before. Bring your awareness back as many times as it takes to build up that sense of connectedness between your mind and the center of the body. If thoughts arise in the mind, do your best to ignore them. Or if ignoring them seems ineffective, then you may make use of that traditional mantra, hearing the sound of the words Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang, coming up from the center of the body for as long as it takes to pacify those thoughts in the mind. The inner object disappears, you can conjure up a new one. If it changes, then you just follow it in its new form, and your practice will become one of observation, observing with equanimity whatever arises in the mind, following the way in which the imagery in the mind evolves as time goes on. We find that the real skill of the meditation is learning how gentle we can be with the mind. If we think that we're already being gentle, but We still haven't come across a sense of lightness in our practice. We might try going down to 10% of the effort that we are using to apply the mind before. If you still haven't come across a sense of lightness in the mind, then go down to 10% of that again, until you're sure that you have really come across a feather-light touch in your meditation. Keep our mind on track at the center of the body in this way, lightly and gently, just for a few more moments now in silence, until we come to time for some loving-kindness meditation. So we continue to maintain the mind gently at the center of the body the whole the time, always connected with that positive energy from the inside that imparts us with a sense of joy, refreshedness, and energy, bringing us a feeling of being wide awake and very much alive. And with the awareness resting at the center of our body, we take this positive energy that we have built up for ourselves, and we're going to spread it first for ourselves, and then for the happiness of those around us. Spreading the energy as loving kindness and happiness from within to those around us. So resting the mind at the center of the body, we spread the loving kindness outwards in ever widening circles into the atmosphere, purifying the environment around us, further and further outwards in all directions, like an aura or a halo extending outwards to all living beings. with the wish that all beings be well and happy, as we spread that loving kindness further and further outwards to all the people we know, those we don't know, those who are still strangers to us, to non-human beings, all sentient life, with the wish that all living beings live in peace and harmony, know only happiness and be free from suffering. Further outwards to cover the whole world, extend the wish that all the people in the world be well and happy, free from suffering, free from illness. Extending loving kindness outwards into the galaxy around us, filling the whole universe with loving kindness and happiness, originating from the center of our body. And at this time we might like to think of loved ones of ours who have already passed away, of our ancestors, or grandparents, wherever they are to be found, with the wish that they too be well and happy, with the wish that all have the opportunity to discover the same inner peace and happiness that we have built up for ourselves in meditation. We continue to make good wishes for ourselves or others, spreading loving kindness now for the last few moments of our practice in silence. Sapa Buddha nupavena, Sapa Dhamma nupavena, Sapa Sangha nupavena, Sattha Soti Bhavantu Te. So if you'd like to come to the end of your meditation for today, you can gradually open your eyes again. If you feel at all uncomfortable, then slowly try changing to a more comfortable position before gradually finishing your practice. So to return gently to our subject matter for today, it's hard to get a good Dhamma discussion going if you don't follow clear guidelines. In other words, you need to be well prepared when you enter a Dhamma discussion. It's not like just having a chat, and as many as 12 issues have to be addressed before a successful Dhamma debate can take place. So to conduct a Dhamma discussion, the first thing you need to do if it's going to be fruitful is to keep the precepts in advance. If you are a householder, you should keep 5 precepts for at least 7 days beforehand, and if possible, 8 precepts would be even better. The precepts will make sure that we embody the Dharma about which we're going to talk. It's not the idea to discuss the Dharma when you're drunk or if any of the participants have been drinking. It's hard enough to make sense of everyday issues under the influence of alcohol, let alone esoteric ones. The slightest misunderstanding can cause a fight. So to discuss the Dharma, you need to be fully in command of your faculties, but alcohol interferes with this clarity. So if you can't even manage to keep the 5 precepts, don't kid yourself that you're going to be able to discuss the Dharma fruitfully. You'll end up arguing over misunderstandings such as whether eating is wicked because of the harm it brings to the bacteria that live in your gut. The second thing which you need to do if preparing for a fruitful Dhamma debate is to meditate in advance. by meditating regularly in the run-up to the discussion and meditating immediately beforehand. In this way, your mind will be sufficiently refined to understand the subtle nature of the subject under discussion. The third thing you need to do if preparing for a fruitful Dharma debate is to dress politely and modestly to participate. The dress code would rule out clothes that are too garish, provocative, sheer, dirty, stained, or ripped. The fourth thing which you need to do if preparing for a fruitful Dharma debate is to maintain good manners. Nothing you do should be potentially insulting to the others participating. The fifth thing you need to do if preparing for a fruitful Dhamma debate is to speak politely. You should speak calmly rather than with excessive volume. The main temple in Thailand, there used to be a training exercise similar to reverse Chinese whispers, where you scored points for saying something to a second person just loud enough for them to hear, but without a third person a little further away being able to hear you. Also, it's not the idea to boast about your attainments or how great your own lineage of meditation is. You should be honest about the limits of your knowledge and not pretend to be an expert in everything. The sixth thing you need to do if preparing for a fruitful Dhamma debate is to give unfamiliar teachings a benefit of the doubt. Even if you don't understand some of the Buddha's teachings when you first hear them, don't refuse them outright. Sometimes we don't instantly understand the meaning of teachings we learn because they are outside our experience or beyond the level of refinement of our mind. Supposing we hear the teaching, forge your own destiny with diligence, if at the time our main project in life is social welfare work, we might assume that the teaching must be wrong. How could it be better to help ourselves rather than to spend our time being altruistic to others? However, reflecting more deeply over time, we will realize that the benefits we bring to others will be of no use in the long term if we are not steadfast too as our first priority. So if you don't agree with the teaching, don't reject it, but express your doubt together with what you think might be a better alternative. Supposing you have already categorically refused the teaching and later someone points out that it is right using appropriate reasons, it will be hard for us to make a U-turn because we will be more afraid of embarrassment than of being wrong. The seventh thing you need to do in preparing for a fruitful Dhamma debate is to avoid provocative language, which means that our choice of words should always be that which fosters harmony. The eighth thing you need to do if preparing for a fruitful Dhamma debate is to avoid expressing anger when confronted by differences of opinion. Even classic proverbs can be contradictory. For example, make hay while the sun shines and more haste less speed. Both can be true in the appropriate context, but not at the same time. If two people have different notions in mind, then they will be sure to have differences of opinion. But we should not let these trivial differences lead to acting out of angry emotions. The ninth thing you need to do if preparing for a fruitful Dhamma debate is to avoid being motivated by thoughts of fame or one-upmanship. If scoring points of others is the reason you want Dhamma discussion, it would be better for you to stay at home. The 10th thing you need to do preparing for a fruitful Dhamma debate is to remind yourself that Dhamma discussions are designed to bring forth wisdom. In other words, they are meant to further our knowledge by using the strengths of others to fill in the gaps in our own knowledge. Dhamma discussions are never supposed to be an excuse to show off how much we know. The 11th thing you need to do is to avoid letting the conversation drift off topic. If we start by talking about generosity and later find ourselves boasting about all the times we've been generous, then we have exceeded the limits of the Dhamma discussion. Similarly, if you find that you are gossiping about how stingy such and such another person is, then again that is no longer a Dhamma discussion. Final thing you need to do is to avoid letting the discussion go on for too long. Otherwise, everyone involved will be bored and the discussion will inevitably go off topic. A second area of concern, if planning to hold a Dhamma discussion, is to make sure you choose suitable participants. Choosing the wrong people to engage in a Dhamma discussion can be disastrous and cause a quarrel. The ideal sort of Dhamma discussion would take place if all the participants are noble friends towards each other. So, for the nature of the discussion to be mutually uplifting, You should invite those possessing the 7 characteristics of a good friend. So, prospective candidates for a Dhamma discussion need firstly to be endearing, in other words, who enable others to feel at ease, ready to ask questions and seek advice. At the same time, they need to be respectable, which means they have the authority to get others to do the right thing rather than the easy thing. They also need to be cultured and emulable, which means that they cannot be a hypocrite, but instead exemplify the virtues that they are discussing. They need to be a wise counsel, which means that they have an accurate understanding of applying Dharma in every context, perhaps through knowing the appropriate time to give due praise or criticism. They need to be a patient listener, always open to others' advice, questions and criticism without being irritated by these. They need to have the ability to explain profound matters in a way which can be easily understood. And finally, they should never be the sort of person who speaks of things for no good reason, or who leads conversations to a useless or harmful end. These criteria apply to conversations where you have some choice over the participants. If the conversation is within the family, then you have to work with what you've got. Turning now to look at the sort of subjects that will make for an effective Dhamma discussion, according to the Buddha, there are 10 criteria known as Katawatu for selecting subjects amenable to a Dhamma discussion. They are subjects that you can't go far wrong with in a Dhamma debate, and include the topics of wanting little, contentment, seclusion, solitude, energetic striving, self-discipline, concentration, wisdom, liberation, and the seeing and knowing of liberation. At the same time, the Buddha advocated avoiding unproductive talk of things like kings, robbers, ministers, armies, panic, battle, food, drinks, clothes, beds, flowers, garlands, perfumes, relatives, vehicles, villages, townships, cities, districts, women, champions, streets, gossip, ghost stories, superficial talk, fables about land and sea, prosperity and decay. In addition, the subject of conversation must be relevant to the participants. If you're going to discuss self-discipline, you ought to choose participants who are invested in the subject. If you are going to discuss meditation, then it should be a discussion between those who have already got down to practice for themselves. Finally, we need to consider the appropriate occasion for the Dhamma discussion. Just like listening to Dhamma teachings, the practice of Dhamma discussion should be regular, perhaps weekly or monthly, or it might be on the occasion of a particular calendar event with an appropriately related topic. For example, a New Year, it might be appropriate to hold a discussion about New Year's resolutions. The choice of time might also differ depending on whether the discussion is planned to be held within a family or more publicly. In the time of the Buddha, even though arahants had already freed themselves of all defilements, they would still hold discussions of the Dharma to sharpen their knowledge, so we cannot underestimate possible benefits to those who are less enlightened. In ancient India, discussion of the Dharma was like the national pastime of that time, with debate on spiritual and philosophical matters to be found in groups meeting informally on every street corner. In Thailand in the 1800s, any village where the mayor was interested in the Dharma would hold a public Dhamma discussion every full moon day. The discussion would have very simple rules so that all the villagers could have the chance to join in. For example, each villager took it in turn to talk about the best good habit they had, something which even the village thief could manage. The nature of rural society in those days meant that a multi-generational family lived together. The young and middle-aged adults would go out into the fields to work. Meanwhile, the old folks would stay at home to mind the children. Usually the old folks would make baskets or do other sedentary tasks, and often they would tell tales to the children playing nearby, often cautionary tales and Jataka stories. And the young children would have a lot of questions for the old folks, and in answering such questions before long, they would strike up conversation on the subject of the Dharma. As a result of such conversations, the children would learn the foundations of ethical behavior from a very early age. These days, the opportunity to discuss Dharma is becoming scarcer because family tends to center itself more on individualized multimedia than shared spiritual wisdom. However, anyone who hopes to pass spiritual values down to their children should realize that they ought to become spiritually literate before it's too late. If a family cannot manage to come together for at least one communal meal per day and talk to each other while doing so, they'll lose the chance for their family to have a Dhamma discussion. Within a better organized family, topics of discussion around the dinner table might take the form of parents giving advice to their children or asking their opinions on certain aspects of their children's behavior. The parents might speak for 80% of the time, with the child contributing 20%. Otherwise, it will end up with the children teaching the parents instead. Another slightly more stylized version of the Dhamma debate is hosted between monks down to the present time in the Theravada tradition, where they give a sermon from two pulpits. That is, two monks with expertise in a subject would discuss that subject with each other in front of an audience. In the Tibetan tradition, there's also the tradition of debating for students and teachers, and you can see them doing the hand clapping to punctuate arguments delivered, with the objective of honing their mastery of scriptural material. While giving a Dhamma talk might be compared to shadowboxing, a Dhamma discussion where the audience can talk back is like boxing against a real opponent. Some Dhamma discussions can have very high stakes. Just as St. Patrick had to debate with Druids to establish Christianity, there have been a series of historical disputations to settle the contest between Buddhism and colonial missionaries. One very high-stakes Dhamma discussion was the debate in Sri Lanka for the right not to be colonized. It's known as the Panadura debate or Panadura Vadaya, and it had its beginnings in 1873. The debate may be considered as a cornerstone for modern Sri Lanka. Rather than being a symbol of fanaticism, it is a landmark in the social transition for the island. The context for the debate was that the movement of Western engagement with Sri Lanka went from curiosity and trading in the 16th century to dominance and exploitation from the 17th to the 19th centuries. At the spearhead of domination, Portuguese, Dutch and British colonists deployed various forms of Christianity, and as a result, Sri Lanka became a colonial protectorate, whereby Buddhism fell into disarray. Buddhist monks were neglected and held in low social esteem. Temples fell into disrepair, and the religion's influence in the nation's social fabric was diminished. The culmination of this disarray was a missionary scholar who had working knowledge of the Pali language called Reverend Daniel Gogoly. As a result of Gogoly's campaign, another Methodist minister called Reverend David De Silva in Panadura Methodist Church then published a series of sermons denouncing Buddhism. The Venerable Migetuwate Gunananda Thero, a robust spokesman for Buddhism, took exception to the sermons and challenged De Silva to a public debate to defend his remarks. Before an almost breathless audience numbering at times from 5,000 to 7,000, the debate lasted a full 2 days. 200 Buddhist monks and several dozen Methodist, Baptist and Anglican clergy were also present, with 14 police officers and a mounted inspector on hand to supervise proceedings. After setting out their positions, each attempted to refute the arguments of the other in hour-long sermons from 8 to 10 a.m., resuming again from 3 to 5 p.m. The Venerable Gunananda's more populist approach appeared to win over the crowd. After each had spoken twice on the first day, at the start of the second day, Methodists brought in a substitute for De Silva, calling in F.S. Sirimane, who was an Anglican lay evangelist. The latter made a last-ditch attempt to win back the crowd. However, at the conclusion of the disputation, the crowd acclaimed Gunananda and Buddhism claimed the victory. Although the Methodist accounts the incident differs from the Buddhist, finding the debate inconclusive, it was conceded that the Buddhists had put the Christians on the back foot. Of course, the debate at Panadura in 1873 was not an isolated incident. It was a culmination of a series of similar events involving Christians and Hindus in Sri Lanka and in India too, in the same era. Nonetheless, it can be argued that Panadura was a watershed that completely changed the social and religious context of Sri Lanka. The debate inspired many, including theosophists like Colonel Olcott, to help to re-establish Buddhism in Sri Lanka, increasing national awareness and paving the way to independence. In 1956, a life-size statue of Venerable Gunananda with his trademark accusing finger was set up as a monument in Panadura, where it still stands today. And English translations of the debate from the times of Ceylon were collected in book form, and in the intervening 150 years have never gone out of print. In conclusion, the principles governing a discussion of the Dharma are that they ought to be by the Dharma and for the Dharma. So Dhamma both in means and in ends. For this to happen, the Dharma needs to be discussed within the scope of what is Dharma. If you want to talk about virtues, don't tolerate mission creep into boasting about virtues. If you want to speak on protecting yourself from temptations, you shouldn't let the discussions digress into gloating about others' addictions. Secondly, you need to discuss by means of the Dharma. Those participating in a discussion must not behave out of keeping with the Dharma. Respect should be given to others where it's due, rather than looking down on other participants you assume no less than you. We need to speak politely with 5-star speech at the very least, and we need to remain polite if occasion arises to point out faults in another's argument, rather than insulting them personally. If you make a mistake yourself, you should apologize humbly, rather than painting yourself into a corner because of your arrogance. Lastly, you need to discuss for the Dharma, which means ultimately the conversation should be for the goal of furthering everyone's knowledge of the Dharma through conversation, rather than showing off or scoring points. In expressing your knowledge, it should be with the aim of facilitating others to share their knowledge with you. It should never be forgotten that whether knowledge gained comes from a sermon or from a discussion, it can be of no use to anyone if we don't practice it for ourselves as a result. As the Buddha mentions in addition to the criteria for subject of discussion, that the most praiseworthy topics of discussion are those where the debaters not only talk about it, but also practice it for themselves. But to finish with today, I'd like to illustrate what goes on during a Dhamma debate, so that you can actually see the skill needed in understanding and answering questions, best illustrated by the Buddha himself, who was forced to explain away a lot of misconceptions brought to the table by an influential Brahmin at the time about why the Buddha did not see fit to pay respect to Brahmins who were more senior than him. And I should mention that this example is one of the shorter ones. There is a longer example, which I didn't have time for, where Brahmin Babari set a whole gang of his disciples on the Buddha with 35 different questions. So to come back to our Brahmin, whose name was Viranja, he once visited the Buddha at Naleru Pichumanta and a series of merely 10 questions, and the way the Buddha responded is a good example of getting to the real question. First, Brahmin Viranja asked, "Is it true that you have no respect for aged Brahmins?" The Buddha replied that because of attainment, not seniority, Brahmins ought to respect the Buddha rather than the other way round. Brahmin Viranja did not understand the Buddha's explanation, put so succinctly, so he continued asking further questions, continuing with a whole series of accusations he had heard against the Buddha. He asked, "Then is it true that you are tasteless?" The Buddha replied that the fact that they say I am tasteless is correct in as far as I have relinquished attachment to the sense perceptions of eye, ear, nose, mouth, and body. But surely that is not the question you really wanted to ask. Next, Brahmin Viranja asked, "Is it true that you are without wealth?" The Buddha replied that the fact that they say that I am without wealth is true in as far as I have relinquished attachment to wealth. But surely that is not the question that you really wanted to ask. Next, Brahmin Viranja asked, "Is it true that you are inactive?" The Buddha replied that the fact that they say I am inactive is true in as far as I exhort my disciples not to commit any evil-doing of body, speech, or mind. But surely that is not the question you really want to ask. Next, Brahmin Viranja asked, "Is it true that you are a nihilist?" The Buddha replied that the fact that you say I am a nihilist is true in as far as I advocate the annihilation of greed, hatred, and delusion from the mind. but surely that's not the question that you really wanted to ask. Next, Brahmin Viranja asked, is it true that you are full of hatred? The fact that they say that I'm full of hatred is true in as far as I advocate the hatred of evil choices of body, speech, and mind. But surely that is not the question you really wanted to ask. Next, Brahmin Viranja asked, is it true that you are a terminator? The Buddha replied that the fact that you say I'm a terminator is true in as far as I advocate the termination of greed, hatred, and delusion, and I teach the Dharma for the termination of all forms of evil and unwholesomeness. But surely that is not the question you really wanted to ask. Next, Brahmin Viranja asked, is it true that you are an incinerator? The Buddha replied that the fact that they say that I am an incinerator is true in as far as I advocate the burning up of the unwholesome states of body, speech, and mind. But surely that is not the question you really wanted to ask. Next, Brahmin Viranja asked, is it true that you will not be born anymore? The Buddha replied that the fact that they say I will not be born anymore is true in as far as I will never again enter the womb or take future birth. Finally, Brahmin Viranja asked, then are you saying that you should be called the oldest because you emerged before all the others? The Buddha replied that in a clutch of hen's eggs, wouldn't it be true to call the first chicken to hatch the eldest of the clutch? I was the first to break through the shell of ignorance by attaining recollection of previous lifetimes of myself and others, and reaching the end of defilements. Only after this explanation did Viranja realize the answer to his original question about why the Buddha thought he deserved the respect of other Brahmins, and appreciating the uniqueness of the Buddha in this world, he took refuge in the Triple Gem as a Buddhist layman for the rest of his life. So this session I have introduced to you blessing number 30 on regular discussion of the Dharma. For my next live session online, which will, fingers crossed, be a week on Sunday morning, we'll continue the first blessing in the 9th group with the blessing number 31 on practicing austerities. For good measure, I'd like to remind viewers that you can email your questions about meditation or what you've heard in this lecture to the email address that you can see spelled out on the slide. And I'll do my best to answer these on my next session. In the meantime, try to avoid recklessness or complacency as we continue to deal with the knock-on health and economic effects of the pandemic. Maintain a positive mood, speak only positive words, forgive others, extend good wishes to others, and meditate daily. Hopefully, as a result of today's session, you will manage to get full benefit from any Dhamma discussions you organize or participate in. So for today, this is me, Phra Nicholas Thanissaro, signing off for now. So long, folks, and stay safe.